and thank you so much for coming to this. We have three really wonderful books to talk about sort of today. So I want to introduce all the authors at the top, and then I'll start asking them questions, and then you'll get to ask some questions at the end. I'll keep track of time. Scott will help me on that. To my immediate left is Annie B. Jones. She owns The Bookshelf, an independent bookstore in Thomasville, Georgia, where she lived with her husband, Jordan, who I believe is in the back, sorry to call you out, for more than a decade. Annie also hosts From the Porch, a weekly podcast about books, small business, and life in the South. Her work and podcast have been featured in Southern Living and Country Living magazines, and her first book is called Ordinary Time, Lessons Learned While Staying Put. To my right is Julian Randall. He is a living queer Black poet from Chicago. He has received numerous fellowships and awards. See, I consolidated a lot down because we'd be reading. He's received a lot of awards, including a Pushcart Prize. He holds an MFA from the University of Mississippi. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Poetry, The Atlantic, Vibe Magazine, among many other places. He is the author of, I forgot to ask you this, is it Refuse or is it Refuse?
It can go either way. I say Refuse, but Ed definitely was.
He's the author of Refuse, winner of the 2017 Cave Canem Poetry Prize, and was a finalist for 2019 NAACP Image Award. He is the author of the Pilar Ramirez duet and the Chainbreakers, but he is here to talk about his memoir, which is entitled The Dead Don't Need Reminding, In Search of Fugitives, Mississippi, and Black TV Nerd Shit. And to my far left is Chyana Marie Sage. And Chyana is a Cree, Métis, and Salish writer from Edmonton, Alberta. She has an MFA in creative nonfiction from Columbia University and recently moved to Toronto, Canada, back home. Her writing has appeared in HuffPost, The New Quarterly, and the Toronto Star. Her first book is her memoir, Soft as Bones. And she writes that Chyana loves to travel and be with nature, and thank you for traveling to Mississippi, and sorry it's so hot. I want to begin with Annie. Now, your book is sort of a series of essays about your life where you find insight and wisdom among sort of life's ordinary things. So I'd love for you to talk about what inspired you to write the book.
So the book does get its title. You can kind of catch it if you grew up perhaps in liturgical circles or things like that, this concept of ordinary time. So if you follow the liturgical calendar, you've got Lent, which you've heard of Easter, but ordinary time nobody talks about, which is ironic because it's the largest bit of time in the calendar. And I like to think that's because most of us are just living ordinary lives. I'm a lifelong reader. I own a bookstore, and I've kept reading all these great stories I love about adventure or big cities or life experiences that it just felt like I was never going to get to have. And so I thought, well, are there books, and I think there are, but are there books that address the quieter aspects of life? What happens if you live 30 minutes from your hometown? What happens if you don't do that big thing that you thought you would always get to do? And so I wanted to write a quiet book for those of us who maybe think our lives are boring, and I would argue if you have conversations with the people in your neighborhood, the people in your community, you know they're not boring at all. And so I really wanted to kind of investigate my own life and see what stories could be found there. And I found that there were quite a few.
Yeah. So I'm struck that, so you own a bookstore, you have a podcast about books, which I have discovered since being assigned this role, and I'm really enjoying it. So you're someone who reads a lot of books, you judge a lot of books.
Yes.
So did that make writing your own story harder or easier?
Terrifying.
Okay.
Much harder, I think, because you know how much good literature is out in the world, and then you know how much maybe not great literature is out in the world. As a bookseller, a book buyer, I see how many books are published every quarter, and I remember talking with publishers and meeting with an editor and meeting with my agent and saying, I just don't want to add to the noise. And there's not just noise in the literary world, but just our culture is noisy. And I didn't want to write something that would just add to that. I wanted to write something that I hoped would be a little bit different, that I hoped might find a different reader. And so I do think that when you read books and you pass judgment on them as a writer, you do have to kind of remember, okay, tune the critics out, and write the story that you were meant to write. But I think for sure it made my life a little bit harder.
And so you say, so this is like a memoir about staying put,
Yeah.
right? Talk about why you chose to stay rather than pursue all of these big city dreams that you read about.
Well, sometimes life chooses for you. And so maybe you don't get into the big university that you think you could get into, or maybe you can't afford the university you want to attend, or you can't afford the travel that your friends can afford. So sometimes life chooses for you. But I also think ultimately a lot of us, even in the panel I just attended previously, they use the same statistic that I think I use in the book, which is like 8 out of 10 people live within 100 miles of their hometown. And it's because most of us actually don't wind up leaving. We kind of have to stay and stick around and live with the story we've been given. And so I wanted to write about staying because that's where a lot of us find ourselves. And that's where my stories came from. I remember when I was meeting with the agent for the first time, and I was telling him kind of what I wanted to write about, and he did not look interested. It was on a Zoom call. I felt like I was boring him until I said, well, really, I think I'd just like to write about what it's like to stay. And he, like, his head popped up and he looked at me and he said, that's what you need to write. And I think it's because there aren't, again, there are some books out there talking about it, but there aren't a lot. And so when I sat down to write, those are the stories that came out. It was, yes, I was forced to stay, and maybe I couldn't do the things I thought I could do. And then ultimately, you start approaching a different age and you realize, oh, I'm not going anywhere. Oh, I'm not, this is it. And, there may be paths, and twists and turns in my story later, but I think sometimes you have to look around and realize, oh, this is the land I've been given. This is the place I've been given.
Well, okay, far be it for me to challenge you on how you analyze your life. But what struck me, and you write about this, is the bold decisions you've made. For example, moving to a small town in Georgia and buying a bookstore. I mean, I don't have the guts to do that. You write very movingly about your sort of decision to leave the church in which you grew up. So talk about that boldness. I mean, not to, screw the whole ordinary time thing.
You can be bold and ordinary.
Yeah, but talk about those bold decisions, because I think that's what really struck me about reading the book.
Yeah, well, I think that's what even maybe struck me while I was writing the book, was realizing, and again, this idea that most of us are living ordinary, quiet lives, but I would argue there is an adventure to be had. There is a boldness to be had in those stories. And yes, did it require some courage to move, courage or youth or stupidity to buy a bookstore in a small town? Yes, it did. I was 27 years old, and breaking into that small town was extremely difficult and painful. But, it wasn't the maybe big city idea I was sold. And I talk a little bit about how maybe in pop culture or in the books I had read or the movies I had watched, success looked like moving to New York. Or maybe if you're a Southerner, at least Atlanta. Like at least go to Atlanta. And my big adventure was going to college in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's like, well, that's not, but I don't know, that's not really the adventure I was hoping for. And so I think staying requires a certain, I do think it requires a bit of courage. And I do think it enabled me to be bold, to take risks, because I hadn't taken risks to go do the big thing that I wanted to do. And so when the opportunity of the bookshelf presented itself, it was scary, but I remember my dad telling me, you're too young to mess this up. You're too young to make a mistake. And so I thought, okay, well, let's try it. And so I think when you stay and you have this home and this land that you've cultivated, maybe it does empower you a little bit to be bolder than you thought you could be. Yeah.
So let's talk about the bookstore, because, when folks fantasize, boy, I'd love to own a small an independent bookstore. I'm seeing Scott Noggle kind of smile in the back because he owns one of these. Talk about the reality of owning an independent bookstore in a small town, and how you think that bookstore is important to the town.
Yeah, well, first I'll say that this past week I spent 5 hours researching state sales tax laws. So if that sounds like something you want to do, own a bookstore, absolutely. I think I really learned early that it's not as, there's a way in which owning a bookstore is just like anything else, in that it is not as romantic as you think it is. At the same time, I am a firm believer in the conversations that happen in a bookstore, in the bookstore as a third place, a place where multi-generations, diverse range of viewpoints and thoughts can gather together. We don't have a ton of those places anymore. And I firmly believe in a bookstore's position in the world. And I also think a bookstore in a small town is vital. I think that I certainly hope Thomasville benefits from the bookshelf and vice versa. I hope that people come to our small town because they've heard of the bookshelf, because they want to see what life is like in this rural part of South Georgia. There is still a romantic part to bookstore ownership. I believe in its mission. I still love opening a box of books on a Tuesday morning. But I also wanted in the book to be very clear, it is bill pay. It is human resources, it's IT, and you're looking around and the only person who knows how to do those things is you. And maybe you don't actually know how to do them. So maybe you have to watch a YouTube video. And so I wanted to show both sides of that because I felt like I maybe went into it a little bit naively, thinking that it would look like the movies. And story time looks like the movies, but payroll and sales tax does not.
Yeah, sales tax. But it's also about community. I love the essay when you wrote about sort of the regular customers who come in, and you say, these are not deep relationships, but they're really important. I'd love to explain that a bit more.
We joke at the bookshelf that we feel like what bartenders must feel like. Booksellers actually hear a lot. Maybe we're almost like your hairdresser or something, where you come in and you tell us a lot of things at the register. So we hear a lot of stories. We know kids' names. We know our customers. And it was actually one of my favorite chapters to write was the chapter called Obituaries. And it's what happens when I started to realize, I'm watching these baby customers grow up into toddlers, into teens, but I'm also watching my older customers grow up. And nobody calls the bookseller when their grandfather dies. Nobody lets the store know that somebody has passed away. And so getting to know my community members in that way has made such a huge impact in my life, probably the biggest impact in my life as far as the store is concerned. And so I wanted to talk about that because to me that's what the bookstore is all about. It's about relationships and it's about community building. I moved to Thomasville. Thomasville, Georgia is about 45 minutes from Tallahassee, Florida. Tallahassee is where I grew up. And so I never moved far from home, but Thomasville did not feel like my home. We joked about it takes maybe, in the South, I think especially, it takes like 20 or 30 years before you're considered local. Thanks a lot, everybody.
You still got a ways to go.
And so I'm still not from Thomasville, which is fine. But I am from the bookshelf, and getting to know customers in that way has been such a privilege and an honor to get to hear their stories. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. Our staff feels that way. The way that we get to know people through their bookish tastes, through our conversations at the register. I mentioned Al and Rose, and one of my highlights of putting this book into the world was I recently got to meet with the Thomasville Book Club, which felt real sweaty, like the locals are reading it now. They said immediately to me, they said, we knew who you were talking about before you even said her name. And I thought, I did a good job then, because they knew I was talking about Rose. And so Rose and Al and Paula all make a place in the book because they've meant so much to me.
Yeah. I really love the essay, Be Ringo. So I guess this is my last question to you. What is Ringo Starr energy?
If only Ringo knew I existed, I would wet my pants.
That'd be a great reveal. And ladies and gentlemen.
Ringo is here. So several years ago, I've always liked the Beatles. My mom was a huge Beatles fan, and so I've loved that's not new information for anyone. Sure, we all like the Beatles. But a few years ago, a documentary came out, and it's called Get Back. I highly recommend it if you've not seen it. And I was paying attention to the Beatles and watching them in this documentary, and I kept paying attention to like Paul, who has big group project leader energy, very type A. He's a genius, but he's the center of everything. And then John Lennon is this artist. George Harrison's a little bit moody, but Ringo's just playing on his drums, and he's like, you can see him in the back, just like planning on his jumps, and he's totally ready. He's never late. I don't know if this is true always or just in this documentary, but he was never late. He showed up, he did his job, and he was ready to go. And never seemed, his feathers were never ruffled. And I remember watching it, and I was thinking, oh, that's really who I want to be. In my daily life as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, as a friend, as a daughter, as a wife, now as a mother, can I be Ringo? Can I be the kind of person who doesn't necessarily walk into every room and take charge, but instead takes a step back, lets other people shine, listens, pays attention, is ready to go when other people are ready for me to be, to be ready. Can I calmly keep the beat? And so that is Ringo Starr energy.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Annie.
Thank you.
All right, Julian, I want to talk about your book. It is a series of sort of beautiful lyrical essays, and a lot of them talk about how you came from, you have roots in Mississippi, your family has roots in Mississippi, but then you came back. You came back. I gesture wildly, I apologize. Talk about what brought you back to Mississippi, a place where you have family roots.
Well, first of all, thank you everybody for being here. It's great to be back in Mississippi always. So the story goes, bless you. So the story goes that when I was in undergrad, I went through a truly life-threatening period of depression. I was in dire straits. Anyway, if you're ever thinking about sending your kid to Swarthmore College, don't. It's a terrible, terrible place. But so after I didn't get a chance to graduate with my class, I am feeling completely unmoored. I am feeling completely unmoored from my own life. And I wanted more than anything just to be a writer, just to make my work and not be bothered with distribution credits. And as a result of that, I applied to a number of MFA programs, and one of the MFA programs I applied to was at Ole Miss, it was the University of Mississippi, right, with Kiese Lehman and Derek Harrell and Amy Nizuka Matado, all of whom are wonderful and whose books you should have prominently displayed in your homes. So that's my story. The story of my family, though, is that my great-grandfather on my father's side, that's the black side of my family, was an extremely light-skinned black man named Albert Edward Leland. He passed for white for a living. He was from Water Valley, Mississippi, as far as we can tell, because all of the town's records were lost in a massive fire, and then a second massive fire 1 month later. So he passed for white for a living. He was an insurance salesman, and he went to the town, passed as a white man, raised my granddaughter had intentions to raise my grandmother rather, as a white woman. And then one day, what was always going to happen did end up happening. All the people in the town file into it one by one, or at least that's how I imagine it, and made it very clear that he had until sundown. He had 24 hours, pack up everything you know, everything you love, everyone you have with you. If we ever see you or anyone you love in this town again, we will tar and feather them to death. And so they kept running until they hit East St. Louis, and that is the story of how my grandmother became the prettiest girl in all East St. Louis, and that's how she met my father. Without that bastard form of mercy, I don't exist. I am not here. I'm somebody else's ghost story.
Wow. And so and I don't mean to jump to the last essays in the book, but you brought up Water Valley and Greenville, but those are incredibly powerful descriptions of how you went to those places to try to find some trace of your family history there. Let's talk about Water Valley first. What was your experience there in Water Valley trying to track down your family?
Folks were nice, but also, a burned document is a burned document, unfortunately. Water Valley is a hop, skip, and a jump away from Oxford, Mississippi, obviously. Everybody in this room knows that. So I go in, I take a rental car, which I did not really have the money for, to go over there, and that was when I went for the very first time. I see that there is a building that is both the fire station, the town hall, and the city clerk's office. And coming from Chicago, I'm used to the idea that a building tells a story about what is needed in that town. And the fact that all three of these are inside of the same place tells me that I'm on the wrong side of whatever story is going on. And that is how I found out. The city clerk's office and then, the Capitol both burned down within a month of each other. And that's why they're all the same building now, so that the fire department can always make it. And they told me that very quietly, like somebody had died. And then I came back, so I was in 2017, and I came back in about 2020 because the world was coming apart, and I didn't want to die without knowing that I'd done everything that I could. So I come there, and they're like, oh, okay, well, here is a list of everyone who is buried in the official Water Valley Cemetery. Now, they don't say official, but that becomes important in a second. So I go through, and it's a couple days, like this is not important to the story, but it's important to me that you know this. It's a couple days before Halloween, so that's how desperate I am for that information. Me, as someone who hates horror movies, is in a graveyard days before Halloween, just begging for it, right? And nothing happens. The closest we come is that there is a man named Baron Leland buried in that cemetery, which throws me for a loop because there's a little cross next to his name, which signals that he was a member of the Confederate Army. So I'm just like, whoa, 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 whoa. What kind of plot twist is this? Turns out, not related to me at all, but it does spark a question, right? Of like, well, if there was a Confederate soldier buried here, why would a Confederate soldier be buried in the same plot as folks who were enslaved in this same town? So I come back and I say, is there a second cemetery? And they say, you know, now that you mention it, Oak Ridge Black Cemetery.
Wow.
So that's how we got to Water Valley.
Yeah. And then, of course, later in the book, you go to Greenville, which is where your great-grandfather lived and was forced out of. And there's so many beautiful passages in the book. And this one I just had to quote because it just kind of hit me. And so I'm going to quote it and just kind of ask you to explain it. My grandmother was from Greenville in the way rubble is from a building that was once standing right there. What did you find in Greenville?
What did I find in Greenville? Okay, so the Greenville trip happens July 2021, and I took that trip with my best friend, and I had, up until that moment, the entire time that I was in Oxford, like I said, I'm a city kid. I'm a Chicago city kid specifically, and so I was used to being able to get to somewhere relatively quickly. I did not know that I needed a car until it was too late for me to afford a car. So by the time that we hit my third year, that's when I finally have the car. And so all kinds of research opportunities opened back up. But the entire time, I had never been able to make it to Greenville. And some of that you can blame on my poetry collection. Some of that you can blame on third year graduation. But fundamentally, it was the fact that I knew this research project has kept me alive. This research project has given me a purpose. This research project has brought me closer to a part of my family history that I thought was completely lost. And so there's this emotional crux point, right? Where like, to go to the town is to accept the possibility that it might be Water Valley all over again, right? That you might pull up and you can't decide if it's better that nobody in the town remembers or that somebody remembers and they're not going to tell you. That you will not be able to tell the difference between these two things. So I pull up to Greenville. Nobody has ever written on a microfiche document legibly in the entire history of microfiche documents.
It's the cursive thing. You know?
It really is just like, yeah, everybody was really super into cursive, and I'm glad to have won that fight with my third grade teacher. But yeah, so I'm going over the records, I'm finding nothing. My best friend looks up the Greenville Historical Society, and it turns out that there's one man on tap there. I tell him the story of how my grandfather was run out of this town. And he says, okay, and goes to the back with no other words. So I'm thinking, all right, well, I've offended him, and there goes my last chance. Then he comes back out with this thick green book. Thick leather-bound green book, and it turns out it's a local phone book, which I never would have thought to look for. But as a result of that, I got to find where my grandmother's house was, where my great-grandfather's insurance office was. I got to stand in those places, and you'll have to take my word for it, because I know poetic license, but trust me, the second we get back in the car from the house, sun shower.
Wow.
The second we get back in the car. And I like to think that that was the ancestors saying, well done.
Wow, you found it. It's amazing. So I also really like the parts where you write about Oxford. And, Oxford is a place that, is sort of beloved by many, but I know sometimes people look at it, what am I trying to say? Let's just be real, that black folks don't always see Oxford the same way as white folks do.
For sure.
Talk about the Oxford Square. It's, it plays a central part in several of the essays and your experience there.
Yeah, so I think that like one of the most important things to know if you haven't been to the Oxford Square, if you have been to the Oxford Square, is that like that really is the heartbeat of that whole town. Like everything and everyone who you need to see is probably around there at some point during the day. But the difference is that just because of the way that first of all, the real estate is absurd. The real estate costs, I have been told, are absurd. But as a result, there's really not an opportunity to see many black folks on the square who are not on their way to work somewhere on the square, right? And that didn't always used to be the case. So that was the thing that was really cool about just like getting an opportunity to dig more into the history of the town, because once I was gone, I realized that where I had failed was that I was researching place the way that with a Chicago mentality, right? Of like where black folks are here, white folks are here, like, we are apportioned out. Like I come from the most segregated city in the North, and like I'm not proud of that fact, but proud of everything else about Chicago. And in reality, it was that, Oxford was conceptualized with the idea that like there was Freedmen's Town, but like black folks lived next to white folks all the time. There used to be black businesses on the square. They used to, in what is now Bourrée, where you can get an incredible sandwich, but like what is now Bourrée used to be a place that you could get an absolutely incredible burger that was made by a black-owned business, and that was because that property used to belong to Molly Barr, and Molly Barr was a contemporary superhero who had all this money. She used it to divide the parcels into clean patches of land, and that was how Freedmen's Town was built. That was how black folks found space on the square. Now, as things have become more commercialized and whatnot, it has homogenized in a really big way, but it's the first time that me, as somebody who had never been to Mississippi before, had roots in Mississippi but had never been, these are the first buildings that I'm seeing. This is the first architecture that I'm seeing. This is the first stories that I'm hearing said. And, site of a number of important spaces in the book, not least of which that Confederate monument, which one of these days it's gonna come down.
And so what's there, although I'm as embarrassed I didn't know this, but someone puts kind of Martin Luther King speeches.
Okay, so that's a wonderful story. That's an incredible story, because I got an opportunity when I came back to Oxford. No longer a mystery. I met those people.
Really?
Yes, as a result directly of this book.
So tell what happened. Yeah, tell them.
Okay, so there are two Confederate statues in Oxford, Mississippi. There's one that stares directly at Square Books, and it's right behind the courthouse. And there's one that's on campus of University of Mississippi itself. So every Sunday, rain or shine, there is a small copy about this big of the collected speeches of Martin Luther King. It's a mint green copy. That part's not important to the story, but it's important to me that you know it. It's a mint green copy of the collected speeches of Martin Luther King. He's got a little picture of his face on the front. And if it's raining, they put it in a little Ziploc bag and they lay it right at the feet of that statue. Like right underneath, they gave their lives for a just and holy cause. Okay. But like right beneath, they gave their lives for a just and holy cause. There is Martin Luther King. And I never was able to figure out who was putting this there, but I saw it every time, and I made sure that I missed it whenever I spat on that statue.
Yeah.
But then I came back to Oxford for the book event, and they were like, "Oh my God, that's Ken," and I was like,
That's the guy.
"That's the guy." I love a reference. You'll find that out across the course of the book.
Yeah. All right, so my last question. So a lot of the essays, I love how you interweave, I guess you call it black TV nerd shit, but you're interweaving popular culture. And I was really intrigued by the way you use things like Spider-Man, BoJack Horseman, Big Crit, the reboot of One Day at a Time. That's an incredibly powerful essay. What made you want to tell your kind of difficult stories about your own life through the lens of popular culture like that?
Word. Okay, so I think that the important thing to know about my relationship with the landscape of Mississippi is that so much of it I've seen from the car, right? And so much of how I learned to fall in love with this state and call it home happened in a car, and specifically happened in a car where the bass is knocking and there's probably something that we can't play over the airwaves going, right? And so it became this way that I was constantly kind of telling the story and answering this recurring question, which happens as a recurring question across the book and happened 3 times as much in my regular life, which is just to say, people see me, they hear me talk. I am clearly not from Oxford, Mississippi. So what am I doing in Mississippi, right? And so as I'm driving and trying to explain this, occasionally I have to stop because, like, hey, Andre 3000's verse is up on International Players Anthem. You quiet down. You know what I'm saying? So eventually, as the book kind of came together, the way that I pitched it was, I want the vibe to be, you are with your friend who speaks mostly in movie quotes and song lyrics. You are taking a road trip down to the ancestral home of his family, and as he is telling you the story of why this place is significant, why this place is important, very much like myself, because it is me, he keeps getting distracted. He keeps getting distracted, and also there's just moments in time, this is just the way that my brain processes information, but the easiest shorthand I have for explaining the kind of person my grandmother was, and specifically why she was that way, is to say, she's just like BoJack Horseman's mom. And there's an entire generation of people, and several other generations of people that tap on it, but there's a whole generation of people who instantly go, oh. And I wanted it to be able to speak to that, oh.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Julian. All right, I want to talk to Chyana. Soft as Bones is an incredibly powerful memoir of your childhood and young adulthood, of finding your way and finding your voice. So I'd love you to talk about what inspired you to tell your family's traumatic story in this book.
It's not a simple question, but
Yeah.
Hi everyone. I'm really happy to be here. It's nice to see so many faces. What inspired me to tell this story?
Why did you have to write the book?
Yeah.
Another way to
Why I felt that it was important to tell the book is growing up as an Indigenous person in Canada and, even in the US here, so much of our histories have been buried and forgotten. But when I was growing up, there was this really ignorant rhetoric that I heard all the time, which was, it happened so long ago. How can it possibly still be impacting your generation? Or you personally weren't in a boarding school or a residential school. How are you traumatized? How is this affecting you? And me writing this and telling my family's story is my way of pushing back against that narrative and really showing exactly how my family and my generation was still impacted, and showing and tracking the ways that these cycles of abuse have trickled down within the lineage and impacted the way that my parents were able to raise me, how they were able to show up or not show up as parents, and how that impacted me in a very deeply traumatic way. And then also, on the flip side of that, not a lot of people are lucky to overcome that and work through that. So many people get stuck in addictions and mental health crises and everything like that. And for some reason, Creator kind of gave me the strength and the tools to move through that and to really heal myself, to become this incredibly happy, healthy, functioning human being that at one point I never thought that I would ever feel real happiness, and now I'm the happiest person that most people know. And so I wanted to also share those experiences and the tools that I learned along the way to meet people on their healing journey, wherever they are, whether you're Indigenous or not Indigenous. I've had people tell me how they relate to my story, and seeing the ways that I responded or processed is helping them on their journey.
Yeah. I really loved how you interweave the story, the memoir, with Native words, Native traditions, stories. Talk about that decision to kind of integrate or kind of interweave that into telling your own story and your family's story.
Yeah, in my culture, growing up as a Cree person, stories are often our way of communicating lessons. It's our way of understanding history, understanding the world around us. And when I was thinking about telling this story and when I sat down to tell this story, those stories just kind of started flowing out of me, and I started remembering them. Particularly, like if I think about kind of my mother's grief, right, of losing her mom when she was only 4, and kind of how that impacted the way she moved through life. When I was sitting with her perspective and her story and writing it out, I immediately was brought back to one of our stories about the origin story of our round dance. And, it's this story of the Northern Lights and this young girl who's grieving the loss of her mother and is kind of like wandering around. And so, to me, it felt like a natural thing to weave those stories together, because as much as I'm telling the hard facts, like the hard histories and truths of my people and my family, I also really wanted to celebrate our culture as well, because there's so much beauty in it. There's so much beauty and fun and joy and silliness even in our stories. Like, we have the woman in the round dance, but then we have this trickster character called Wasaki Chuck, and he gets up to all sorts of shenanigans. And, so I wanted to capture those stories, and so I wrote some of my own Wasaki Chuck stories, and I wrote my own Wheat to Go story. And if you hold up the book for them, you'll see the cover is this figure. It's a deer head, but it's representative of this figure called the Wheat to Go, which is like this dark cannibalistic spirit. And I use the Wheat to Go as a way of exploring the darkness in my father and the trauma that he perpetuated, but also the trauma that he inherited as well. And so my father was the only family member that I didn't interview when writing this book to capture those stories. And my way of still breaking into that, his childhood and his history, was by writing my own Wheat to Go story that was exploring his youth that, I had learned through other family members and my own experiences with him, and then including like the Cree words. So I call the book like a braided spiral, and it's comprised of 4 parts, and every part I begin with a new Cree word. And that was also my way of celebrating and making space for our languages when, all of my relatives, like my grandfather, his first language was Cree, but then when he was put into the 60s scoop and residential schools, they were no longer allowed to speak their languages, and we were no longer to do our ceremonies. So that's why it felt really important to me to include those words as like a celebration of the beauty of those languages, and to capture them in time forever.
Yeah, no, it's very lovely. I think that you mentioned the 60s scoop, and so I read this book, and I'm familiar with boarding schools in this country. In the last few years, there's been greater attention and research being done about Native American boarding schools and the way that they were used to disrupt and destroy Native culture. But the Canadian story, I think, is even beyond that. Talk about Native American boarding schools and what I had to Google, the 60s scoop, and explain what that is and how that affected your family.
Yeah, so the 60s scoop was a movement that largely began in the 60s. And so this was after the government sort of started moving away from residential schools. Like, it started coming out that, all of our children were dying and there was so much disease and malnourishment. And so they created this movement by an organization called AIM, which is Adopt Indigenous and Métis, where they would take the Indigenous children away from their families, and they would put them into white foster homes all over Turtle Island. So, sometimes they would move them across the border, and sometimes they would change their names. And you can actually see like these ads of children in newspapers at the time where it's like, this is little Arthur, and he's very cuddly and he smiles a lot, and these devastating things. And so this movement directly is like what happened to my grandfather and all of his siblings. They were all taken and scattered. Some of his relatives and siblings he never saw for 20 years, and some passed away and he never saw again. And when I was thinking about and trying to understand what my father did and why he did it, I spoke with my grandfather and really listened to his stories, because I asked him what felt like an impossible question, which was where do you think this anger came from? Because the man that raised my father was very different from the grandfather that I know. And, he told me the story. He's like, I think it came when they took us away from our home. And, this is like a 70-year-old man sobbing and telling me this whole story, like for one of the first times he's ever said it out loud. And it was a very cathartic and healing moment and experience for the both of us. But this movement happened all across the country, and it just created a disruption, not only in the family unit, but a disruption in the cultural unit, and it created this isolation. And so that's why largely so many of my people are still really battling with addictions and substance abuses and all of these, different ways that human beings have learned how to cope and mask like deeply traumatic experiences.
And then that also explains or helps explain why you felt committed to use Native words and Native traditions into the book to try to reclaim those. All right, well, you mentioned before that it's sort of a braided story that tells the story multiple times from different perspectives. So reading the beginning of the book, you talk about your father, who's a crucial figure in your life and your story, and it's from a children's perspective, from your perspective, and you portray your father as, as a dad you loved and really important to you, and you kind of drop the terrible things that he was doing sort of matter-of-factly. And then you come back around at the end and portray your father through the eyes of your sister and your mother. Why did you write it that way, and why did you end with your mother and your sister's perspectives on that?
Yeah, I think I didn't want to tell this story in a super linear way, because to me that's not how memory works. That's not even how history works. And if you read the quote that I have in the beginning, it's a quote by Ocean Vuong, and he's talking about how history moves in a spiral, and so each time it moves around, we're just one circle removed from that epicenter. And so yeah, thinking about the structure, if you read even the beginning, I talk about where should I begin this story? Do I begin with my father? Do I begin with my grandfather? Do I begin with me? Because in a way, where is the beginning and where is the end? And I chose to begin the story with my childhood because it was sort of like the beginning of the end is the way that I kind of interpret it, because I view myself as the breaker of these chains, the breaker of these curses, if you will, and me choosing to, heal and rise above it. So I decided to begin there, but, I also knew that this story couldn't be told without all of these different perspectives. And, so I kind of move us through history and braid us through time, but, coming to the end, that part 4 that you talked about when I give particularly my sisters, because my mom comes in part 2 and it's my sisters that come in the 4th part. And in a way, it was almost like a self-protective measure, because you would think when telling this story that the most difficult part of telling it would be talking about my experiences with my father. And that wasn't the case at all, because I had done so much healing and releasing and processing of that I really felt ready to tell that. But what was the most tender for me actually was my sisters, because they're so close to me. They're the ones that I love with all my heart. Their children are the ones that I play with and spend time with. And, they're the pinnacle of all my love is a line that I write there. And, so saving them and coming to the end in a way was almost like a self-protective measure. But I view that final part as the final braiding of taking part 1, part 2, part 3, and weaving them all closely together so you can see the ways that all of the different stories and histories have been wound up together and how they're all interconnected.
Yeah, it's very powerful. At the end, you talk about how writing this book is almost like a snake kind of having to shed its skin, and you describe how a snake sheds its skin. Talk about that, and then how you felt like this had to be your first book. It's not going to be your last book. You're already working on another, but why did this have to become first?
Yeah, that process of ectasis, right? Where when the snake is shedding its skin, it's a solitary journey, it goes off on its own and it sort of pushes its head and rubs itself against rocks and hard surfaces and literally peels its own skin off of itself. And my journey with writing the book kind of felt like that, and felt kind of necessary, because even writing it, I was not someone who stayed. I was someone who left, and I had to leave. I think I had to be out of my family and on my own, and moved by myself to New York City to finish writing this book. And I moved there with nothing but 2 luggages and $300 in my bank account, and sold everything I ever owned in order to like make that dream come true, and to write this book and be on my own, and to tell that story. But I've always been a writer, you know. As soon as I learned how, I was always writing. I was writing first songs, and then poems, and then short stories that were just veiled accounts of the truth. And when I finally was ready emotionally to tell the story, I knew that it was time. And I felt like my soul couldn't write anything else until I had gotten this truth out there in the world, as a way of unburdening not just myself, but also my family, because me writing this story has been not just this cathartic experience for me, but it's also been kickstarting my family members' journeys, because they're, even some of the older ones that have been kind of running away from these truths for a really long time. And now, after having shed that skin and told this story, I kind of write about how I want to keep that skin and wrap it delicately around this book, and offer it to my ancestors, and offer it to all of my family members that have passed on, but have felt so close to me every step of the way while I've been writing this book.
Wow, thank you. We will open it to questions, but I'm going to ask the first one just because, and it's a question for all of them. So these are memoirs. I read about them. I learned a lot about your personal lives. There were questions. I was curious about certain things that, frankly, I don't feel comfortable asking you, or certainly not in front of all these people, right? So how do you balance, when you're writing a memoir, sharing your story, but also maintaining your personal privacy or boundaries? Or is there none? Or you never worried about it? I'd worry about it, but I'm neurotic.
Okay, so this is a space where having come up as a slam poet kind of helps, because it is very much a writing tradition where vulnerability is deeply encouraged, and a base part of how everybody interacts with folks. There were as a result of it, there were people who I knew were trans long before their family, long before their cousins, long before anybody who surrounded them in school, and it was because they have these 3 days. We have these 3 days to build a lifelong solidarity, to build a lifelong friendship, right? And so you have to be honest in that context, in that circumstance. The entire time that we've been, at least the folks who are my age have been writing, the world has been so actively ending. There's no time to be I'll be honest about that when I'm 50. Who knows if I genuinely am saying, who knows if I will make it to 50? 50's not even that old, but there's genuinely there's no guarantor that that's going to be a thing that happens. And so I have to be okay with the fact that in order to tell this story, I have to say that I didn't want my own life. In order to tell this story, I have to mention that, my grandmother, who, there's, a grand tradition in African-American literature, in Black literature, however you want to phrase it, that, our grandmothers are sources of magic. My grandmother was not a source of magic. That was taken away from her at a very young age, and it turned her into a very mean person who loved me, but was very mean to everyone else around me. And I have to be honest about that, or you don't understand why this story is important.
Yeah. Do y'all have any thoughts on that? Boundaries versus being openly vulnerable in your work?
I mean, I think you mentioned, and I'm sure other writers feel the same way, but also it takes practice. And for most of us, we've been writing since we were kids, or storytelling since we were kids, journaling or writing poems or short stories or whatever. So I do think some of it comes with practice. And I do think it goes back to tuning out the voices. I really couldn't think about Thomasville reading my stories, or I really couldn't think about that part because I was worried then I would censor myself, and that doesn't really do service to anyone, the reader or the storyteller.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's memoir is not this big exposition on your family or something, but it's a moment where you can convey truths and the things that you have learned from those truths. But that doesn't mean you have to tell every aspect of the truth. And there was many things that I kept private and kept close to me, and there were things that I learned that were just for me and my healing journey. And especially, like, you know, because my father was mainly very abusive to my older sister. And so to me, it was important to protect her story as well, and to know what's my story and what is solely someone else's, and to treat that with respect and love and care. And so I remember at Columbia, one of my professors that teaches this class called Family Matters, she advised everyone, she said, write about your family and don't let them read it, and tell everything. And that just didn't resonate with me at all. And so I did not take that advice whatsoever. And, you know, I protected my family's stories. And not only that, but I let them read it. And I said, is this okay? Like, you know, am I doing justice to this? Is there anything you want redacted and taken out? And there was nothing that they wanted taken out. And I feel like, but that doesn't mean you just share the good either. Like, it was really important to me to capture the good with the bad, because that's the truth of all of us. We are not all good. We are not all bad. We are deeply complex human beings. And I feel like I did my very best to capture the complexity of every single person that I bring forward in the memoir. And I think when they read that and they saw that, I think that they were happy with seeing, you know, my best try at the full scope of who they were.
Wow, great. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Susan Klein with my co-writer Stephanie Painter, and we have just written 4 years long the memoir of Dr. Sandra Rockoff, who was a political prisoner in Uzbekistan for 5 years. And we're trying to find a publisher now, and one comment we got was that we don't, this was from, and they had actually an agent. We don't think that memoirs written by third parties are selling that well. And I'm interested in what your opinion of voice is. Should we go back and rewrite in their voices? Like, one thing we've read is Saving Sound, and that was written in each person's voice. So could you talk about what?
Well, of course, each of these books are written in your own voice because you're writing about your own experiences. But, I mean, any thoughts on voice and the voice you tried to cultivate in your work?
Write his own story because he's not fluent in
Yeah, sure.
Word. Is it okay if I hop in? Okay. So I guess like my first thought in this is like when we're thinking about like reframing and like how do we like fit voices together, like how much the author shows up in that, and like how much of this is like a journey that is like told from the perspective of the writers in conversation and communication with the man, insofar as like then it feels like the whole choir is singing together, right? It's not it's not three different people singing two different songs. So I feel like maybe like that's a structural angle in terms of just like figuring out like basing the reader in like, why do you care about this? Because I think about like, you know, Hanif Abdul-Rakib was in this room earlier today. Many of you were probably also there, in which case I am jealous. But he often speaks about, and this is like a bit of a divergence, but like he talks about how for pop culture, he writes from the perspective of the fan, right? Like he writes about why he loves what he loves, why he cares about what he cares about. And as a result of that, you might find out, like, I am a dyed-in-the-wool hip-hop fan. I will read a Hanif essay and be like, damn, Fall Out Boy forever, right? So there's, it's a silly comparison, but like, where is the Fall Out Boy forever in the construction of that manuscript?
Any other questions? Well, yes.
Chyana, I want to thank you for being here. You know, I'm Anishinaabe, Métis, one doesn't expect to run into a Cree relative. Thank you for being here. Thank you for telling your story. Julian said something about coming up in the car and the sun came out, and then to you that was a message from your ancestors for doing the right thing. Did you ever encounter a point in writing your book when you're telling more than your own story? There were all of these people who never had an opportunity to speak at all, let alone have their stories told.
Yeah.
Do you have a similar relationship? I mean, that really took hard to say. And I'm curious.
Yeah, I had quite a few of those actually. One of which was the moment that the title of the book came to me. And I always have my morning tea and I sit there sort of just like by myself, and that's, my me time. And I was sitting there having this tea, and from, the heavens, so to speak, from the universe comes soft as bones. And I was like, soft as bones, soft as bones. I just started saying it over and over again. And then I wrote a poem about it. And it became my sort of philosophy for a long time, but before it was the title of the book. But then when I started writing the book, I was like, that's what that is. That's what that's supposed to be. So that was definitely one of those moments. And then there was this, it's like these feelings I get. So I've had lots of like nature things, but there are particular sensations I get from particular relatives that have now passed on. And so one part is my Auntie Debbie was my favorite auntie, and she passed away in 2019. And years before, she was sick with cancer, we were sitting and having tea at her table, and she was telling me about her time in residential school. And she said how there was this girl in the green dress whose spirit she'll never forget, because this girl in the green dress would always try to run and try to escape, and the nuns would bring her back, and she would disappear for a week. And again, you would see her try to run through the field and run away. And in that moment that we had, she said, I want to write a short story about this one day. Like, I want to tell the story of the girl in the green dress. But she passed on and she never had that opportunity. And when I was getting close to writing the end of the book in part 4, the girl in the green dress came to me, because I didn't plan on telling it, but I got this sensation all over my whole body, and I knew it was my Auntie Debbie there. And I'm getting like emotional like now, but like I knew that it was like her telling me, like, tell the story. Yeah.
So all of the authors will be signing, and I will just vouch for all of these books are worth buying and reading. Please go talk to them at the signing tent. This is not going to shock anybody, but, I'm a bit different from the people on this panel in terms of the stories they wrote, and I was struck by reading the power and importance, struck by the importance and power of reading about lives that are different from our own. Ultimately, Memoir is about humanity, empathy, and connection, and during a very scary time. Recognizing and cherishing the humanity in others, I think, is especially vital right now. And I believe amongst of the many ways we get out of this, this is certainly one of those ways. And so I want to thank all of the authors for their work, for their efforts to share their own stories, and by doing so, strengthening our common humanity. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for your rest.